Talk to Jamie Jenkins, our favourite statistician down in Welsh Wales. Jamie, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. The world's gone mad as usual.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what. I mean, I don't remember the last time we came in and kind of didn't have anything to talk about. I mean, there was a time when the news cycle occasionally went quiet. I mean, this is potentially supposed to be the silly season. You know, there's no football on. You know, people take a bit of time out. There's meant to be the courts closing down. Soon they'll shut down Parliament. You know, it was meant to be a little bit quiet in those days, but I don't think it's ever going to be quiet ever again.
No, there's no football on, Mike, but Lineker's still managing to probably earn £1 million a year, you know. That's one of the good things being Gary Lineker.
Yeah.
You can earn a fortune and the football's not on. And you can argue get paid for the World Cup, maybe, I suppose, during some years.
Somebody once said
every year.
Somebody once said to me, the trick in life is to make money while you sleep. And I think he's managed it very, very well indeed. Let's talk a bit about the Covidinquiry. You've been tweeting about it, some Welsh relevance as well. But I mean, the Covidinquiry thus far hasn't produced many statistics for you, has it?
No, well, the first part of this Covidinquiry, Mike, is Module 1, which is focusing pretty much on how the different countries prepared for the pandemic. Right. So it's a pretty boring part of it, I suppose. You know, I think if you go on the Covidinquiry YouTube channel, it's pretty much streaming all day, every day, and it's going to last till 2026, Mike. So I think a lot of people will be falling asleep by the end of 2026 on that. But we are getting some little bits because there's naturally... Hancock's been there, Whitty's been there, you've had Jeremy and Cameron, you know, we've had loads of people there, and some stuff has been coming out which is which is a bit of interest, I suppose. So one of the things that I've taken over the last 3 or 4 weeks, just from a Welsh perspective, and I'll just give you some thoughts on Whitty in a second, Mike, is that last week Vaughan Gething, so he was the Welsh Minister in charge of health. Yeah, so, you know, in Wales, same as you had in England, you'd have him rocking up on press conferences with Drakeford every now and again during the pandemic. And there was a question put to him about looking at the plans to prepare for a pandemic. Because remember, health is devolved. England run their health system, Wales run their own. So he was asked by one of the barristers there about looking at the documents related to kind of pandemic plans in Wales. And he admitted he hadn't read anything before kind of the pandemic. And they asked, when did you read them? And his response was, well, I've read them in preparation for this inquiry. It's remarkable, Mike. You know, a minister now, he may not have had time to have read them all maybe at the first start of his appointment. But surely, Mike, when a pandemic hit and they were going to say, well, what are we going to do? Surely we got some plans on this. That would have been the time to have read it. And Drakeford yesterday, Mark Drakeford in the Senate was questioned on this by the Conservative leader, Andrew R.T. Davis, and he kind of defended him, saying it's not possible for ministers to look at the back catalogue of documents, even though some of these documents, Mike, were relevant at the time that the minister was in post.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, one thing you could do during COVID was read an awful lot because there wasn't much else to do. And even if you're a government minister in Wales, presumably there was a lot of downtime because you weren't going to functions, you weren't really doing much in the actual public arena because you couldn't. You were working on Zoom, doing everything. And also, these people have all got special advisors, haven't they, that we pay for? Why are the special advisors not kind of doing a summation of whatever the pandemic rules are and giving them the sort of bullet points from it?
Exactly. So, you know, if you get a new CEO who takes over a company, they may not know the ins and outs of that company, but the role of a CEO or any senior person in business, Mike, as you will know, is to ask the right questions. You will learn, and if you're not actually understanding your brief, you're not going to ask the right questions. And I guarantee, Mike, you know, we'll get more in Module 2. That's going to be the tasty stuff. I'm sure you'll be covering a lot more of that because that's going to basically go into what were the reasons and the evidence behind Boris and Drakeford and Sturgeon doing all of these different measures. But I guarantee, Mike, there'll be nothing in this pandemic plan that... Remember Drakeford put these bans on certain aisles in shops?
Well, I'm just looking at your Twitter, and I remember that people were up in arms, weren't they? Because they made certain things completely off limits and said were not essential items, which I think also did not include some clothing and newspapers as well.
Oh, yeah, Mike, some really bonkers stuff was decided on this. The argument the Welsh Government gave at the time is we've closed all these other smaller stores that sell similar stuff. Right. So we've got to stop Tesco's and Asda's, you know, the big supermarkets selling it as well, which was nonsense, Mike. But the other thing I'll probably touch on from the Covidinquiry, which is what Hancock and Whitty have said in recent weeks. So Hancock was doubling down on, you know, we got to recognise we might need hard, long, fast lockdowns maybe earlier. But Chris Whitty, that's the most remarkable thing I've viewed so far in the inquiry, when he came out and said that he was challenged specifically on lockdowns, which meant that you would have to stay indoors, not a really stringent quarantine for the whole population. And his admission, Mike, was that he would have thought it would have been very strange for Sage to have suggested that unless a senior politician did. So I think we need to find out in Module 2 who were these senior politicians pushing for lockdowns.
Well, this is the thing, because there are two different narratives going on here. Because one was that Boris Johnson didn't want to lock down and therefore was told to do so by the scientists, and the scientists convinced him. But they tell a different story, and they say, no, absolutely not. We actually urged him not to lock down at the beginning, and you know that because we were told that we wouldn't stop people coming into the country at the airport, because apparently, according to the scientists, the virus is already here, so there's no point in shutting down the airports. But we weren't allowed to go anywhere.
Well, hopefully there's documentation on a lot of this, Mike. So Boris, that's one of the things.
Well, hopefully you've got the WhatsApp messages, right?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the stories that's kind of been kept off the front pages by this BBC storm this week is Boris Johnson's first phone. So remember a few weeks back, Mike, he said, I'm going to hand over all my documents. And then they went to the court to say, well, we don't want to hand over everything of Boris Johnson's. This is the government. Well, he's got another phone. And this phone actually goes at the start of the pandemic up to, I think, around May 2021. It's been switched off since then because of a security breach, because apparently his number was available online for people. So they're trying to work out at the moment, Mike, how to switch this phone on so they can get access to the WhatsApp. We're in the 21st century here, Mike, trying to switch on a phone. Absolute nonsense here. So you would hope these SAGE meetings that were going on, there's minutes of who said what was the advice, because at the moment, Mike, all I'm hearing, politicians blaming officials and officials blaming politicians. It's a bit of, they've got at fault, we're at fault, you're at fault. Who's getting the answers? We won't get a report, Mike, until about probably in this rate 2030.
Which is disgraceful, really, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Mike. How many people whose lives are put on hold were going to be dead before they even knew the outcome of what we're going to... And the thing that's just crucial on this one, Mike, is, we're talking about how we were prepared for the pandemic. We're talking about how we've responded to the pandemic. We need some answers, Mike, because the cost of living crisis, Andrew Bailey again this morning talking about inevitable that people will have problems paying their mortgages. The cost of living crisis was directly related to the pandemic response as well. And so you can't divorce all of the mess that we're in now from the decisions that were made. But will the COVID inquiry go into that? I very much doubt.
Well, that's the thing. It's probably not qualified to do so, but people like Peter Hitchens were warning from the beginning that this furlough business, that the locking down of the economy, that the closing down of railway stations and all of that was going to have a massive knock-on effect, and inflation was going to go through the roof. He actually used those words, that inflation was going to be affected. Everything he said has come completely and utterly true.
Well, the one good thing for me, Mike, is I think a lot of us found you through the pandemic, the home of common sense.
True.
Listening to you, Mike, through the pandemic, and obviously you got me on partly way through it, has been a kind of a lifeline for a lot of people, because you're cutting through a lot of the nonsense that's been discussed in all of this. You're right. Printing all of that money by the Bank of England, having that furlough scheme started the fueling the inflation crisis. The lockdowns meant the energy demand went down, so the companies want to make their money back. So the cost of energy, from the suppliers around the world has gone through the roof. And the mental thing now, Mike, is you've got the same people who were loving life in their gardens during lockdown, that first lockdown, struggling now to even pay their mortgages in the same gardens. It's absolutely mental.
I know, because people were re-educated, if you like, and many people quite enjoyed the re-education if they had a middle-class job and a laptop and they could sit at home, smiling at the wife and petting the dog and having a cheese sandwich and not having to go out, sit on a horrible stuffy packed train with loads of other ghastly people they didn't like, and now they don't want to do any work, because why wouldn't they?
And that's what's changed the world, I think, over the last 3 years. There's some advantages to having less commuting going on, but, one of the key things when it's talking about the working from home bit there, Mike, is you cannot beat, especially the younger people, you cannot beat that time in the office, learning, being mentored by individuals. That bit's kind of been lost. And where I live in Wales, Mike, the Welsh government actively discourage people going to work. It's as if it's still in the middle of pandemic, partly to do with, net zero climate change. It's better if you're all at home.
Yeah. Well, don't get me started on that. The one question I would ask you, I don't know if you heard this story at the weekend, but I was talking to Richard Tice about it, that the Met Office has admitted, apparently, to kind of slightly adjusting some of the figures when it comes to the temperature of the world over the course of the last several decades. So much so that in the sort of period between, say, 2002 going back to the kind of 90s, they've slightly turned down the volume to make it look as if it was cooler, and they've slightly turned up the volume since 2002 to make it seem as if it was hotter, so that when they said the other day that, you know, last Monday, I think it was, a week ago Monday, was the hottest day ever in the entire history of the world, it actually wasn't.
No, the main thing I point out when I talk about this, Mike, is, you know, the world is a long time we had the world going. You know, even if you just consider, say, the last 2,000 years, that's only a fraction of how long the world's been here. But a lot of these decisions on, you know, the climate and the temperatures rising are based on pretty much data from the last 100, 150 years. And I think on that temperature one there, the Met Office, I believe, has got some data that goes back even further, which would question whether or not that was a record. So I think ultimately all you seem to get from the Met Office these days is warnings of this, warning that we obviously got this heat wave going across Europe at the moment, I think, big warnings. And the thing in Wales last week, we were warned of a heat wave when the temperature was going to get up to 23 degrees. That's pretty much summer, isn't it, Mike?
Well, exactly right. That's what we call it. You know, 23 degrees, very nice, very pleasant to walk around in. It's nice that it's not to be not raining, for heaven's sake. But listen, Jamie, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Jamie Jenkins there with an update for us on what's going on at the COVID inquiry, which, of course, is still ongoing. Laura Dodsworth mentioned it yesterday. And yet, very few people are actually picking up on what's being said.